On a calm afternoon in St Mary Mead, a single glance changed everything. Miss Marple noticed a gate touched too often, a voice lowered too quickly, and a garden that seemed to listen. What appeared to be polite village routine soon revealed unease hidden beneath teacups and careful smiles. By the time shadows stretched along the wall, nothing felt accidental anymore for those who knew how to observe quietly. Chapter 1. The first thing Miss Marple noticed was not the garden itself, but the way Mrs. Linton lowered her voice while speaking of it. It happened before the teacups had even been properly set upon the small iron table near the winter roses. Mrs. Linton leaned in slightly, as though the hedges might overhear, and said that she hoped everyone would find the afternoon pleasant, despite a little disturbance earlier in the week. She smiled as she spoke, yet the smile had a tightness to it, which suggested effort rather than ease. Miss Marple caught the change at once and stored it away with quiet care. St Mary Mead lay beneath a pale afternoon sky where the light seemed reluctant to warm anything fully. The vicarage garden was neat in that particular village way, where every path and shrub suggested long habit rather than recent attention. Winter roses nodded gently near the low wall, and the air carried the faint scent of damp earth mixed with tea steam. Miss Marple had arrived with a soft word of thanks and a gentle comment about how well the roses had endured the cold. Mrs. Linton replied readily enough, but her eyes flicked towards the garden gate as she did so. Miss Marple followed the glance without seeming to. The gate stood half open, and the latch rested at an odd angle. It was not broken nor loose, yet it bore the look of something handled too often in too short a time. The metal had a dull smear upon it, where fingers had pressed again and again. Miss Marple did not stare. She never stared. Instead, she allowed her gaze to drift, as though admiring the ivy creeping along the wall while she took in the detail all the same. Mrs. Pritchard arrived moments later, carrying a plate of small cakes and an air of helpfulness that had long since become part of her reputation. She greeted Miss Marple warmly and spoke of the weather and the difficulty of keeping kitchens dry in such a season. As she set the plate down, she leaned closer to Mrs. Linton and said in a whisper that was meant to be private but rarely ever was in St. Mary Mead that it was a mercy the garden had not suffered worse given the worries the household had already endured. Miss Marple accepted a teacup and listened. Mrs. Linton stiffened slightly at the remark, then laughed too quickly, and said that worries were nothing unusual these days. Her hand shook just enough for the tea to ripple against the china. Miss Marple noticed how she steadied it with the saucer a fraction sooner than most would. It was a small thing. It always was. Conversation turned to the church fefty plans and the need for volunteers to mind the raffle table. Mrs. Pritchard spoke briskly about donations and mentioned that certain families had been less forthcoming than one might hope. Her eyes flicked once again to Mrs. Linton, and this time there was something sharper beneath the polite tone. Miss Marple murmured agreement and remarked upon the way village efforts always revealed more than people intended. Mrs. Pritchard smiled thinly at that and changed the subject at once. It was during this exchange that Mrs. Linton mentioned the stranger. She spoke as though the matter were hardly worth attention. And yet her voice dropped again, and her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She said that earlier in the week, a man had appeared at the garden gate, asking about the greenhouse path. He had claimed to be looking for directions, yet his questions had been oddly specific. Before she could think to ask further, he had vanished behind the yew hedge at the far end of the wall. Miss Marple commented gently that hedges in St. Mary Mead were very good at hiding things. Mrs. Linton laughed, but did not meet her eyes. Mrs. Pritchard interjected that there had been talk of unfamiliar faces lately, and that one could never be too careful with valuables about. She said it loudly enough for the word valuables to settle heavily between them. At that precise moment, a small cry came from inside the house. It was not loud nor dramatic, but it carried a note of real distress. Mrs. Linton rose at once, knocking her chair slightly against the table. Tea slopped, and a spoon rang sharply against china. Miss Marple saw Mrs. Pritchard flinch before schooling her face back into concern. They moved indoors together, where the drawing room lay in tidy order, except for one small empty space upon the side table near the window. Mrs. Linton stood before it with her hands clasped and said that her mother brooch was gone. She spoke as though stating a fact rather than seeking comfort, yet her eyes darted towards the doorway, as if expecting someone to appear. Miss Marple stepped closer and examined the table without touching it. She remarked upon the quality of the polish and the care with which the room was kept. Mrs. Linton nodded distractedly and said that she always put the brooch there when she removed it. She had done so only that morning. Mrs. Pritchard said at once that the stranger must be responsible and that it was fortunate no one had been hurt. She spoke quickly, and her tone had an edge of triumph which sat oddly with the situation. Miss Marple noticed how she did not look at the empty space, but at Mrs. Linton's face instead. A search was suggested, but Miss Marple gently discouraged a flurry of activity. She said that confusion often hid clarity, and that a quiet look was usually more revealing. Mrs. Linton agreed at once as though grateful for permission to pause. As they returned to the garden, Miss Marple allowed herself to lag behind by a step. Near the stone bench she saw it. A muddy print rested on the edge of the path where someone had paused and turned. The tread was narrow, and the soil clung fresh, as though recently disturbed. Miss Marple bent slightly as if adjusting her shoe and took in the shape and direction. It pointed not towards the gate, but towards the garden wall, where the yew hedge thickened. She said nothing. Back at the table, Mrs. Pritchard spoke in a lowered voice and said that everyone knew the Linton finances were not as comfortable as they once had been. She said it with the tone of someone sharing concern, yet there was satisfaction beneath it. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Linton face paled and how she pressed her lips together before replying that such matters were private. Miss Marple intervened with a gentle remark about how money worries often led to misunderstandings rather than misdeeds. Mrs. Pritchard smiled at that, but her eyes hardened briefly. Tea resumed, though the warmth had gone from it. A shadow passed along the garden wall, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought it was a cloud. Then she saw the shape move again deliberately and smoothly, as though someone knew exactly where to walk unseen. Mrs. Linton did not look. Mrs. Pritchard did. Miss Marple watched her eyes widen just a fraction before she bent to adjust her glove. The movement was quick, but it was enough. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. She listened to the birds settling in the hedge and the distant sound of the village beyond. She felt no fear, only a quiet certainty settling into place. When the afternoon drew to a close, Mrs. Linton thanked her guests with careful politeness. Miss Marple took her leave with a soft word about the roses, and a promise to return soon. As she passed the garden gate, she touched the latch lightly, and felt the warmth of recent handling still upon it. She paused by the stone bench once more, and looked towards the wall. The muddy print remained clear and untroubled. Miss Marple smiled kindly to herself. She had seen enough to know that what had moved through the garden was not merely a stranger nor an accident. It was intention dressed as chance, and it had left its mark. And Miss Marple, smiling, kindly knew she had just seen the first shadow of something dreadful. Chapter 2. Mrs. Pritchard began the story before anyone had asked for it, and that alone told Miss Marple that the village had already chosen its favorite explanation. It was the next morning, and the air held a damp chill that made curtains cling to windows and shoes pick up mud with discouraging enthusiasm. Miss Marple had walked into the little village shop with the quiet purpose of buying biscuits and listening to whatever happened to be said. She had learned long ago that people rarely guarded their words in places where they felt ordinary and safe. They guarded them in drawing rooms. They loosened them by baskets of apples and jars of jam. Mrs. Pritchard was there already, standing near the counter as if she belonged to it, her handbag tucked close. Her voice pitched in that bright, helpful way that allowed her to say almost anything, while sounding as though she only meant well. She was speaking to Mrs. Harris, who ran the shop with a mixture of kindness and exact change. It was about the Brook, of course. Mrs. Pritchard said that she had always warned Mrs. Linton about leaving things about, even inside, even among friends. One never knew these days, she said, who might be watching, who might be listening, who might be waiting for a moment when a door was not quite shut. She sighed as though the world were a great burden placed upon her sensible shoulders. Mrs. Harris murmured that it was a shame, a real shame, and asked if Mrs. Linton was terribly upset. Mrs. Pritchard tilted her head and let her mouth soften into a sympathy that did not reach her eyes. She said that Mrs. Linton had been fragile lately, and that it was hardly surprising given the strain. Then she added, very carefully, that there were always reasons people tried to sell things quietly. There were always reasons people welcomed visitors from London. The shop fell into one of those small silences that are not truly silent at all. Someone rustled a paper bag. Someone cleared a throat. Miss Marple chose a tin of biscuits with the concentration of a person comparing labels, and listened. Mrs. Harris glanced at Miss Marple and smiled politely. She asked how Miss Marple was settling back in, as though Miss Marple were a guest of the village rather than one of its most steady presences. Miss Marple replied warmly, and said it was always pleasant to be among familiar faces, especially in a place where people noticed the smallest details. Mrs. Pritchard gave a small laugh at that and said that St Mary Mead did indeed notice everything, which was why it was best not to give the village anything to talk about. Miss Marple said softly that the village talked anyway, and usually about what it least understood. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes flickered. Just for a moment her smile tightened, then returned. Miss Marple paid for her biscuits and stepped aside, letting others reach the counter, and in doing so she placed herself in the exact position where she could hear without appearing to. Two women by the bread shelf began murmuring about the stranger Mrs. Linton had mentioned. One said she had seen a tall figure near the yew hedge a few days earlier. The other said she had heard it was a man with a scarf, though she could not say where the scarf detail had come from. It had simply appeared, like so many village details did, fully formed and accepted. A young man entered the shop then, and the conversation shifted as if a gust had moved through it. Edward Linton. He brought the city with him in the small ways. His coat was too smart for the weather, and his shoes looked polished in a village that did not reward polish. He had the look of someone who expected the world to arrange itself around him, though he tried to soften it when people glanced his way. Mrs. Harris greeted him with her usual professional kindness. Mrs. Pritchard greeted him with something sharper, almost affectionate, as though she wished to be seen as close to the family. Edward smiled and asked for cigarettes in a tone that suggested he did not wish to be questioned. Miss Marple watched him without staring. She noticed how his eyes went briefly towards the back of the shop where the post office counter sat behind a half door. She noticed how his fingers tapped once against his pocket. A quick nervous gesture, and then stilled. Mrs. Pritchard said in a voice meant to be casual that it must be good to have him home again. Edward replied that London was London, and the village was the village. His words sounded light, but Miss Marple heard impatience beneath them, as though the village air were too slow for him. Mrs. Harris asked after his aunt, Mrs. Linton, and Edward said she was well enough. He did not look at anyone as he said it, and the sentence ended a fraction too quickly, as if he wanted it done. A small gossip remark floated from Mrs. Pritchard like sugar in tea. She said that the family had been through so much, and that it was difficult to keep a house running properly without proper funds, and that one could not expect a woman to bear all that alone. The implication hung politely in the air. Edward's jaw tightened before he relaxed it again. Miss Marple stepped forward then, with biscuits in hand, and greeted Edward as though he were simply another neighbor. Edward managed a smile, and said he had not expected to see her so soon. Miss Marple replied that villages had a way of bringing people together at precisely the right moment. Edward laughed politely, but his eyes slid away from hers. He left the shop quickly, and as the bell above the door rang behind him, the village seemed to breathe again. Mrs. Harris leaned forward slightly and said in a lower voice that Edward had returned very suddenly, and that it had surprised everyone. Mrs. Pritchard said it had surprised her too, though in her tone surprise sounded like judgment wearing a hat. Miss Marple carried her biscuits out into the street where the damp air smelled faintly of coal smoke and wet leaves. She did not hurry. She never hurried. She walked towards the post office, for letters were always interesting, and so were the hands that received them. Mrs. Pritchard had arrived there ahead of her, as though she had floated on gossip alone. Mrs. Linton stood at the counter, waiting for stamps, her posture composed, her hair neat, her gloves proper. And yet Miss Marple noticed at once what Mrs. Linton tried to hide. Her signature. Mrs. Linton wrote her name in the ledger with a careful flourish, but the pen wavered slightly at the end. It was not the tremble of age. It was the tremble of strain. Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Linton lifted her hand afterwards and pressed her fingers together, as though easing a cramp. Then she smiled too brightly and thanked the clerk, as if nothing were wrong. Mrs. Pritchard spoke to her about the brooch, as though offering comfort, yet every sentence carried a little pinprick. She said it was dreadful, dreadful, and that perhaps Mrs. Linton should have more help in the house, someone to keep an eye on things. Mrs. Linton replied that she managed perfectly well. The clerk mentioned that a letter had come from Mrs. Linton earlier and been forwarded to the house. Mrs. Linton's face changed so quickly that only someone watching closely would have seen it. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. Then she smiled. She said yes, quite. Thank you. Miss Marple said softly that letters could be such a nuisance, and sometimes such a blessing. Mrs. Linton laughed a little too sharply. Mrs. Pritchard watched her. They left together, and Miss Marple followed at a gentle distance, as if simply walking the same path. At the corner where the lane turned towards the Linton house, Mrs. Pritchard paused and placed a hand on Mrs. Linton's sleeve. Her voice lowered, her tone turned intimate, and Miss Marple caught only fragments. There was something about arrangements, something about keeping things quiet, something about not letting the village imagine the wrong thing. Mrs. Linton replied with stiffness, and then Mrs. Pritchard smiled again, the way one smiled when one believed one held the better cards. Miss Marple continued on her way, turning instead towards the vicarage where she was staying. The garden looked peaceful in daylight. Birds hopped along the path. The winter roses held their heads as if nothing in the world could disturb them, and yet the gate latch sat in the same odd angle as the day before. Miss Marple paused, pretending to examine a small cluster of ivy. She touched the latch with one gloved finger and felt again that slightly polished warmth of overuse. Then she looked down at the soil near the stone bench. The muddy print remained, though the edges had softened slightly overnight. Someone had stepped there and turned. Someone who had not cared to wipe their shoes. Someone who had expected not to be seen. The vicar wife called Miss Marple in for tea, and the invitation sounded like comfort. Inside, the house smelled of toast and marmalade. The sitting room held that gentle clutter of a life lived quietly and honestly. Miss Marple sat down, accepted her cup, and listened as the vicar wife spoke of the village with affectionate exasperation. She mentioned the brooch, naturally. She mentioned Mrs. Linton Paleface. She mentioned Mrs. Pritchard taking charge of everything as if the matter were her own. And then, as she poured milk, she added something else. She said that the gardener, Mr. Hale, had come by early that morning looking troubled. He had asked whether anyone had seen a narrow black scarf. Miss Marple lifted her eyes. The vicar wife said that Mr. Hale had left the scarf on a garden chair the day before, while trimming near the wall. He had gone back for it later and found it missing. He seemed upset in a way that did not match the value of a scarf. He had kept repeating that it was his, and that he needed it back. When asked why, he had colored and said it was simply a favorite. Miss Marple thanked her quietly and asked what kind of scarf it was. The vicar wife said it was narrow, black, and rather neat for a gardener. Miss Marple nodded as though thinking only of wardrobe choices, but she was thinking of shadows. A suspicious domestic clue appeared in the smallest way. As the vicar wife spoke, she placed a small dish of sugar on the table. The lid did not fit quite right. It sat slightly crooked. It was the sort of thing a person might ignore. But Miss Marple noticed it. and then noticed the reason. The dish had been chipped, and the chip was new. Not important by itself, perhaps, yet new chips came from sudden movements, from hands that were not steady, from people who were distracted. Miss Marple smiled kindly at the dish, as though it were charming, and said nothing. After tea, she walked to the Linton house with a small basket of biscuits as an excuse. Mrs. Linton received her in the drawing room with careful grace. Her face looked tired beneath the powder. Her smile was polite and practiced. Miss Marple spoke of ordinary things first. The weather, the roses, the church flowers. She let the calm settle around them like a shawl. Then she mentioned the Brook, not directly, but with a soft remark about how certain pieces carried family feeling. Mrs. Linton's hand tightened on her teacup. Her eyes went to the empty space on the side table, and then away. Miss Marple asked gently if there had been any further sign of it. Mrs. Linton said no. None at all. She said the police were not involved, and her voice held a note of insistence, as though she were making a decision rather than stating a fact. Mrs. Pritchard arrived in the middle of this, without knocking in the way of people who believed themselves welcome. She carried a small tin of biscuits and an expression of concern that felt staged. She greeted Miss Marple warmly, and then turned at once to Mrs. Linton with questions. Had the cupboards been checked? Had the staff been spoken to? Had Edward been asked where he was yesterday afternoon? She spoke Edward's name lightly, but there was a faint sharpness under it. Mrs. Linton replied stiffly that Edward was family and did not need to be questioned in his own house. Mrs. Pritchard said, of course, and yet her mouth tightened at the corners. Miss Marple watched the exchange and noticed another small change. When Mrs. Pritchard mentioned the greenhouse, Mrs. Linton blinked twice in quick succession. It was the sort of thing many would not see. Miss Marple did. Mrs. Pritchard said that perhaps the stranger had used the greenhouse path to approach unnoticed. Mrs. Linton replied that no one could get in that way without being seen. Her tone was too firm. It sounded rehearsed. Miss Marple took another sip of tea and filed that away. As Mrs. Pritchard stood to leave, she dropped her gloves. It was a small accident, the sort of thing that happened. Miss Marple watched her bend to pick them up. The inside of one glove had a smear of soil, dark and damp. Mrs. Pritchard noticed Miss Marple glance and quickly folded the gloves together as though hiding the inside. She smiled brightly and said she had been in her own garden, of course. Always so much to do. Always such a nuisance this season. Mrs. Linton did not smile back. When Mrs. Pritchard had gone, Miss Marple rose as well. She thanked Mrs. Linton for tea and spoke kindly of rest and not overtaxing oneself. Mrs. Linton nodded without quite listening. In the hallway, Miss Marple paused near a small side table where letters were usually placed. There were none there now. The table looked bare in a way that felt deliberate, as though someone had removed every paper to avoid seeing it. Miss Marple stepped outside, and the cold air felt cleaner. She walked slowly towards the garden, letting her eyes wander as if admiring shrubs. Near the hedge, she saw Edward. He stood with his back half-turned, smoking, as though the outdoors bored him. When he heard footsteps, he turned too quickly. His smile came late. Miss Marple greeted him and asked if he found the village restful. Edward said it was quiet enough. His tone suggested quiet was an insult. Miss Marple remarked that quiet places often held very busy thoughts. Edward laughed briefly and flicked ash away. His hand shook slightly as he did so, and he hid it by shoving his other hand into his pocket. Miss Marple noticed the cuff of his coat. There was a faint dust on it, pale and gritty. It looked like dried glass dust, the sort that clung when one brushed against greenhouse panes. Edward followed her gaze and then shifted his arm so the cuff turned away. He said he had not been near the greenhouse. He said it quickly. Miss Marple only smiled and said that gardens had a way of leaving their mark on everyone who walked through them. Edward forced another laugh. As she moved away, she saw him glance towards the garden wall. and for the briefest moment, the confidence left his face. He looked like a boy who had stepped too close to a pond and heard the ice crack. That evening, back at the vicarage, Miss Marple stood at the window with her hands folded and watched the lane grow dim. The village settled into its evening routine. Curtains were drawn. Lamps glowed. Somewhere a radio murmured softly. And then, just as the last light thinned, a figure moved near the garden wall of the Linton house, slipping behind the yew hedge with the smoothness of someone who knew exactly where the shadows lay. Miss Marple did not lean forward. She did not gasp. She simply watched, her expression gentle, her mind very clear. Because the figure was not tall like the imagined stranger of village gossip. It was narrow, careful, familiar. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, felt the calm certainty of suspicion settle like a cool hand on her shoulder, for she had just seen that the village was pointing at the wrong person, while the true shadow moved quietly, where no one thought to look. Chapter 3. Miss Marple noticed the scent before she noticed the room, and that in itself was unusual. The greenhouse door stood ajar in the soft light of late morning, its glass panes clouded with condensation and faint streaks where hands had brushed them aside. Mrs. Linton walked ahead with a careful politeness, apologizing for the disorder as though the plants themselves might feel judged. Miss Marple assured her gently that growing things were never truly tidy, only patient, and stepped inside with the quiet attentiveness of someone entering a drawing room, rather than a place of soil and pots. The air should have smelled of damp earth and leaf mold. Instead, there was lavender. Not strong. Not obvious. Just enough to be noticed by someone who paid attention to such things. Miss Marple paused a moment longer than necessary and drew in a small breath. Lavender water, she thought, the sort kept in a bedroom drawer or dabbed onto linen. It did not belong among seed trays and watering cans. Mrs. Linton chattered softly about the difficulty of keeping plants healthy through the winter, about drafts and frost and the way the glass sometimes cracked without warning. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple observed that she did not quite meet her eye. She spoke as though reciting something she had already practiced. Miss Marple moved slowly along the narrow path between shelves, her shoes avoiding puddles with unconscious precision. She remarked on a row of seedlings and asked how long they had been there. Mrs. Linton hesitated, then said not long at all. Miss Marple nodded kindly and did not mention that the soil had settled as though the pots had not been moved for several days. A suspicious domestic clue lay tucked behind a large terracotta pot near the back wall. It was nothing dramatic, nothing that would cause alarm. Just a folded handkerchief, pale and carefully pressed, embroidered with the neat initials E.L. Miss Marple saw it without reaching for it. She did not touch it. She simply took note of the way it had been hidden, and the care with which it had been placed. Mrs. Linton noticed her pause. Her tone changed slightly as she asked if Miss Marple was warm enough. The concern sounded genuine, but there was a tightness beneath it, as though she wished to hurry the visit along. Miss Marple replied that she was quite comfortable and remarked on how peaceful the greenhouse felt despite everything. Mrs. Linton smiled faintly and said that peace was sometimes only an appearance. They left the greenhouse together, and Miss Marple thanked her for indulging her curiosity. Mrs. Linton said, of course, as though grateful the inspection was over. Outside, Mr. Hale stood trimming a low hedge with careful strokes. He straightened when he saw them and removed his gloves, nodding politely. Miss Marple greeted him and commented on the state of the garden. Mr. Hale replied with the reserved pride of someone who took his work seriously. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noticed that his eyes flicked briefly towards the greenhouse door before returning to her face. She asked him casually whether he had found his missing scarf. The effect was immediate. Mr. Hale's fingers curled slightly around his gloves. He said no, not yet. He added that it was of no importance. Really, only a thing he was used to wearing. His tone suggested the opposite. He spoke too quickly, as though eager to dismiss the subject before it grew uncomfortable. Miss Marple said gently that people often missed familiar things more than valuable ones. Mr. Hale nodded, but his mouth tightened. He glanced towards Mrs. Linton, then away again. Mrs. Linton intervened, saying she was sure the scarf would turn up. Her voice carried an edge of firmness, as though she wished to close the matter entirely. Miss Marple thanked them both and walked on, her pace unhurried, her mind very busy. She did not go far before encountering Mrs. Pritchard at the garden gate. Mrs. Pritchard appeared as though summoned by the mention of her name, her expression one of brisk concern and helpful authority. She said she had heard Miss Marple was visiting and hoped everything was well. Her eyes darted briefly towards the greenhouse, then to the house, then back to Miss Marple. Miss Marple replied that she had been admiring the garden and found it very instructive. Mrs. Pritchard smiled at that, but the smile faltered when Miss Marple added that certain scents told interesting stories. Mrs. Pritchard laughed lightly and said that she herself was fond of lavender and used it everywhere. She said it a little too eagerly. Miss Marple noticed the faint flush that crept up her neck. Mrs. Pritchard went on to speak of Mrs. Linton affairs with a tone of exaggerated sympathy. She mentioned how difficult it must be to manage a household with worries hanging over it. She mentioned London again, and pawnbrokers, and how such places asked many questions. She spoke as though speculating, yet her words landed with precision. Miss Marple murmured that money troubles often led people into awkward arrangements rather than dishonest ones. Mrs. Pritchard's lips pressed together for a moment, before she smiled again. As they parted, Mrs. Pritchard adjusted her coat, and a small folded paper slipped from her pocket to the ground. She bent quickly to retrieve it, but not before Miss Marple saw the corner of it. It was a receipt. Miss Marple did not ask. She never asked when answers were offered freely by chance. She only watched Mrs. Pritchard tuck it away with a little too much care. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage and settled herself by the window with a cup of tea. The vicar-wife spoke of ordinary matters, of parish schedules and errands, of who had promised what for the next church gathering. And then, as she buttered toast, she mentioned something in passing. She said that Edward had been seen earlier near the greenhouse, though he had told everyone he had not gone near it. She said it without judgment, merely as an observation. Miss Marple nodded and said that young people often forgot where they had been when they were thinking of where they wished to go. The vicar-wife laughed and agreed. A subtle change came when Miss Marple asked if Edward had seemed settled. The vicar-wife hesitated before answering. She said that he seemed restless, as though the village did not suit him anymore. She said he spoke sharply to Mr. Hale earlier over nothing in particular. Miss Marple listened and imagined the exchange with quiet clarity. That evening, Miss Marple walked alone along the garden path as the light faded. She paused near the greenhouse once more, not entering, only standing by the door. She noticed how the latch had been wiped clean, how no fingerprints marred the glass now. Someone had been careful. She bent slightly and examined the mat at the threshold. Pressed beneath it was a small, torn corner of paper, thin and yellowed, with part of a printed word visible, and a faint line of ink that looked like a number. She did not remove it. She did not touch it. She straightened and walked away as though she had noticed nothing at all. From the far side of the garden came the sound of voices. Mrs. Linton spoke softly. Mrs. Pritchard replied in a whisper edged with urgency. Miss Marple did not hear the words, only the tone. It was the tone of negotiation rather than comfort. A pause followed. Then footsteps moved away in different directions. Miss Marple stood very still. The scent of lavender drifted faintly through the evening air, carried from the greenhouse like a polite lie lingering longer than intended. Miss Marple smiled kindly to herself. For gardens, she knew, were excellent places for growing truths as well as flowers, and someone had already planted too much care in the wrong soil. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that the greenhouse had just offered her something far more valuable than any missing brooch. Chapter 4. Miss Marple noticed the hymn book long before she noticed the hymn. It was the way Mrs. Pritchard held it that drew her attention, pressed close against her chest as though it were not merely a book of familiar verses but something that required guarding. The church of St Mary Mead was cool that morning, the stone holding the night chill, and the congregation settled themselves with the soft rustle of coats and polite murmurs. Sunlight filtered through the high windows and rested in pale squares along the pews, touching faces gently and revealing more than people often intended. Miss Marple took her seat near the middle, where she could see without being seen. She folded her hands and allowed her gaze to wander with the air of someone listening only for comfort. Around her, the village arranged itself into its usual order. Familiar faces, familiar habits. And yet beneath it all ran a quiet current of strain that had not been there before. Mrs. Linton sat 2 pews ahead, her back straight, her hat pinned with care. She did not turn around. Her hands rested in her lap, gloved and still. Yet Miss Marple noticed how she pressed her fingers together, as though reminding herself to remain composed. Beside her sat Edward, his posture relaxed to the point of carelessness. He stared straight ahead, jaw set, as though determined not to notice anything at all. Mrs. Pritchard sat on the opposite side of the aisle, slightly forward, perfectly positioned to see and be seen. She nodded to acquaintances with brisk smiles, the sort that implied helpfulness and judgment in equal measure. When she opened her hymn book, she did so with deliberate care, smoothing the page before resting her hand upon it. The opening hymn began, and voices rose together, filling the church with a sound that was both gentle and insistent. Miss Marple sang softly, her attention divided between the melody and the small movements around her. She noticed Mrs. Pritchard glance twice towards the Linton pew during the first verse. She noticed Edward stop singing altogether by the second, his mouth still while the rest of the congregation carried on. As the hymn ended, Miss Marple saw something else. Mrs. Pritchard turned a page and paused. Her fingers lingered as though uncertain. Then she closed the book a fraction too quickly and held it tighter. Miss Marple saw the corner of something pale pressed between the pages, just visible before it disappeared again. A subtle change passed over Mrs. Pritchard's face, so brief it might have been missed by anyone less observant. Her mouth tightened. Her eyes flicked towards the church door and then back to the altar. Miss Marple smiled gently and looked ahead once more. The service continued with readings and familiar prayers. The vicar spoke warmly of patience and honesty, of burdens shared and quiet strength. Miss Marple listened, thinking how often such words settled differently on different ears. She noticed Mrs. Linton's shoulders stiffen at the mention of trust. She noticed Edward shift in his seat when the vicar spoke of responsibility. When the time came to stand again, Mrs. Pritchard rose a moment too quickly, bumping her hymn book against the pew. It slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor with a soft thud that echoed more loudly than it should have. Several hands reached for it at once, but Mrs. Pritchard bent swiftly, retrieving it herself with an embarrassed laugh. She brushed at the cover and murmured apologies. Miss Marple, however, had seen enough. As Mrs. Pritchard lifted the book, something fluttered free from between the pages and landed at her feet. She noticed it at the same instant Miss Marple did. There was a pause, no more than a heartbeat, before Mrs. Pritchard stepped forward and covered it with her shoe. Miss Marple did not move. After the service, the congregation spilled out into the churchyard where the air felt fresher and voices grew louder. Small groups formed, exchanging pleasantries, discussing the weather and the state of the paths. Miss Marple lingered near the stone wall, greeting people as they passed, her manner as mild as ever. Mrs. Linton emerged with Edward, close behind. Mrs. Pritchard joined them almost at once, her tone bright and her concern unmistakable. She spoke of the service, of how comforting it had been, of how the village must stand together in times of difficulty. Mrs. Linton replied politely, but without warmth. Miss Marple watched the exchange from a distance. She noticed Mrs. Pritchard place her hand lightly on Mrs. Linton's arm and lean in to speak more quietly. She noticed Edward stiffen at the contact and glance away, his face darkening. A few steps away, the vicar wife spoke to Miss Marple and mentioned in an offhand way that she had heard raised voices near the lich gate earlier that week. It had been Edward and Mr. Hale, she said, arguing about something trivial perhaps, though it had not sounded trivial at the time. Miss Marple asked gently what it had been about. The vicar wife frowned and said she could not be sure. Something about access. Something about leaving things where they did not belong. Mr. Hale had looked flustered, and Edward had been sharp, almost rude. They had parted quickly when they realized they were being observed. Miss Marple thanked her and said that misunderstandings often grew in silence. The vicar wife agreed, and sighed. As the churchyard thinned, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Pritchard moving towards the gate with purposeful steps. She hesitated only a moment before following at a respectful distance, her pace unhurried. Just beyond the lich gate, Mrs. Pritchard paused and looked back. Her eyes narrowed slightly when she saw Miss Marple approaching, then softened into a smile. Miss Marple greeted her warmly and remarked upon the service. Mrs. Pritchard agreed enthusiastically and said it had done her good. Her voice was light, but Miss Marple noticed her grip tighten on the hymn book she still carried. Miss Marple asked casually whether Mrs. Pritchard often marked her favorite hymns. Mrs. Pritchard blinked. She laughed and said she liked to keep track of verses that spoke to her. Miss Marple nodded and said that some words lingered longer than others. They parted then, and Miss Marple continued on her way, turning back towards the church. Near the spot where the hymn book had fallen, she saw it. A small sprig of yew lay on the ground, pressed flat and dry as though it had been kept carefully between pages. Miss Marple bent slowly and picked it up. She examined it for a moment, then tucked it discreetly into her glove. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage and sat down to write a note. As she reached for paper, she noticed that her own hymn book lay open on the table, left there by someone else. She glanced at it absently, and then paused. A page had been marked. She turned it carefully and found a faint pencil note written along the margin. It was small and neat, easily overlooked. A time. And 2 words. Garden wall. Miss Marple closed the book and sat very still. She thought of the muddy print near the stone bench. She thought of the yew hedge thickening shadows along the wall. She thought of Mrs. Pritchard's glance during the hymn and the way she had covered the fallen paper with her shoe. The evening passed quietly. Supper was taken. The radio murmured. Outside, the village settled into itself once more. As dusk fell, Miss Marple stepped into the vicarage garden. She walked slowly along the path, her hands folded, her mind alert. Near the hedge, she paused and looked towards the wall. Nothing moved, and yet she felt certain that something had already been arranged to do so. She returned inside and placed the sprig of yew beside the note she had found. They lay together on the table, silent and unremarkable, and yet they spoke clearly to her. Miss Marple smiled kindly, for the church had offered more than comfort that morning. It had offered a schedule, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that someone had chosen a place and a time where they believed no one would think to look. Chapter 5. Miss Marple first became aware that the shed was locked, not because anyone mentioned it, but because everyone avoided mentioning it. The morning carried a thin brightness that made the village look freshly arranged, as though nothing unpleasant could possibly belong to such a day. Miss Marple walked along the garden path at the vicarage with slow deliberation, her hands folded, her mind receptive. She had learned that avoidance was often louder than accusation, and that the things left unsaid usually demanded the closest attention. The shed stood at the far edge of the garden, partly screened by a line of shrubs that had been planted years ago for no reason other than habit. It was a practical structure, weathered and plain, with a roof that dipped slightly at one corner, and a door that bore the marks of long use. Miss Marple had passed it many times before without remark. Today, however, something about it felt different. The padlock was new. It shone faintly in the light, incongruous against the aged wood, its metal unscuffed and clean. Miss Marple paused, as though admiring the shrubs, and let her eyes rest upon it. New locks were usually purchased for reasons, and reasons in St Mary Mead were rarely as simple as they appeared. She did not approach it at once. Instead, she continued along the path, observing how the soil near the shed had been disturbed. There were faint marks where feet had shifted, not hurriedly, but with purpose. Someone had stood there for a moment, perhaps longer, before deciding what to do next. Miss Marple smiled gently and walked on. Mr. Hale appeared from behind the hedge, carrying a small bundle of tools and wiping his hands on a cloth. He greeted her politely, though there was a tightness to his manner that had not been there before. Miss Marple returned the greeting and remarked upon the fine weather, then asked casually whether the garden was keeping him busy. Mr. Hale replied that it always did. He spoke carefully, choosing his words as though he were selecting tools. When Miss Marple glanced towards the shed and commented on the new lock, he stiffened. He said that things had gone missing. It was best to be cautious, he said. One could never be too careful these days. His tone was respectful, but there was something rehearsed about it, as though he had practiced the explanation. Miss Marple said softly that caution was wise, especially when people felt unsettled. Mr. Hale nodded, but did not meet her eyes. He said the key was with Mrs. Linton. It had seemed proper, given the circumstances. Miss Marple noticed how his fingers tightened around the cloth when he said it. She thanked him and continued her walk, leaving him standing by the hedge with his attention fixed firmly on the ground. Later that morning, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Linton under the comfortable excuse of returning a book she had borrowed some days earlier. The house was quiet in that particular way that suggested its owner was listening for something. Mrs. Linton received her in the drawing room with a smile that sat carefully upon her face. They spoke first of ordinary things. The roses, the weather, the difficulty of keeping fires going without overheating rooms. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to unfold naturally, offering small remarks that invited ease. Gradually, Mrs. Linton's shoulders relaxed. It was then that Miss Marple mentioned the shed. She did so lightly, almost in passing, as though it were of no more interest than a garden bench. She said she had noticed the new lock, and hoped it had not caused inconvenience. Mrs. Linton hesitated. The pause was brief, but it was enough. She said that there had been minor concerns. Tools misplaced, small items not where they should be. It was nothing serious, she assured Miss Marple. Just a sensible precaution. Her voice carried a note of insistence, as though she were convincing herself as much as anyone else. Miss Marple nodded kindly and said that sensible precautions often made people feel safer, even if they changed nothing else. Mrs. Linton smiled at that, but did not reply. A small domestic clue appeared without announcement. As Mrs. Linton poured tea, the spoon struck the cup with a sharp clink that rang louder than necessary. Mrs. Linton winced and steadied the cup with both hands. Miss Marple observed how she took a breath before setting it down, as though calming herself. She noticed the faint tremor that passed through Mrs. Linton's fingers, and the way she quickly folded her hands into her lap to hide it. Miss Marple spoke of rest and the importance of not overburdening oneself. Mrs. Linton agreed readily and said she had been tired lately. Too much to manage, she said. Too many small matters requiring attention. She smiled as she spoke, but the smile faltered at the edges. A knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Pritchard entered with her usual brisk confidence, carrying a basket and an air of helpful concern. She greeted Miss Marple warmly, and immediately turned her attention to Mrs. Linton, asking how she was feeling and whether she had slept at all. The questions came quickly, one after another, leaving little room for answers. Mrs. Linton replied politely, though her voice cooled. Miss Marple noticed the change and watched with interest. Mrs. Pritchard said she had come to offer assistance, that she felt it was important to keep things running smoothly, especially with so much talk about the missing brooch. She said the word missing with emphasis, as though wishing to keep it alive. Miss Marple remarked gently that talk could make matters heavier than they needed to be. Mrs. Pritchard smiled and said that silence could be far worse. As they spoke, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Pritchard's hands. They were neatly gloved, but when she removed one glove to take a cup, there was a faint stain on the cuff beneath. It was pale and irregular, the sort of mark left by scented water dabbed hastily, and not quite absorbed. Lavender, Miss Marple thought. Mrs. Pritchard noticed her glance and shifted her hand out of view. Conversation turned to Edward. Mrs. Pritchard asked whether he had settled in again. Mrs. Linton replied that he was adjusting. Her tone was clipped. Mrs. Pritchard said young men often found village life slow after London. She said it with a little smile that suggested she believed she understood him very well. Miss Marple said that impatience often made people careless. Edward, she said, had a way of moving quickly even when stillness was wiser. Mrs. Pritchard raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Linton stared into her teacup. The sound of footsteps came from the hallway, and Edward himself appeared at the door. He looked surprised to see Miss Marple, then composed himself. He greeted them politely, though there was tension beneath the courtesy. Mrs. Pritchard addressed him at once, asking whether he had found anything of interest that morning. The question was vague, but Miss Marple noticed how Edward stiffened. He said he had been for a walk. Nothing more. His eyes flicked briefly towards the window that looked out onto the garden. Miss Marple followed the glance without seeming to. Miss Marple remarked casually that the shed was well secured now. Edward froze for a fraction of a second before replying that it was sensible. He said it quickly. Too quickly. Mrs. Pritchard said she thought so too. She added that the key should be kept safe. Edward said of course, though his hand moved unconsciously towards his pocket as he spoke. Miss Marple noticed. She excused herself shortly thereafter, leaving the house with quiet thanks. As she walked along the garden path, she heard voices rise behind her. Mrs. Pritchard's tone sharpened. Mrs. Linton replied in a low voice that carried strain. Edward said something she could not hear, but the sound of it was abrupt. Miss Marple continued on without turning back. Near the shed, she paused once more. She examined the padlock again and noticed something new. The wood around the door bore faint scratches, shallow but clear, as though someone had struggled to close it in haste. The marks were recent. Miss Marple bent slightly, as though adjusting her shoe, and looked closer. The scratches ran inward, not outward. Someone had forced the door shut, not tried to break in. She straightened and stepped away. Later that afternoon, the vicar wife mentioned in passing that Mrs. Linton had sold a few small items recently. Nothing important, she said, just sensible housekeeping. Miss Marple nodded and said that sensible housekeeping often involved difficult choices. She listened as the vicar wife spoke of Mrs. Pritchard's frequent visits, of how she seemed to know everything before anyone else did. Miss Marple smiled and said that some people collected information as others collected stamps. As evening drew in, Miss Marple walked once more towards the Linton garden. The light faded slowly, leaving the hedges heavy with shadow. The shed stood dark at the edge of it all, the new padlock catching the last of the daylight. Miss Marple stood still and watched. A faint sound reached her ears, the soft scrape of metal, the smallest click. She did not move. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure near the shed, moving with careful familiarity. A hand reached out, touched the lock, hesitated, then withdrew. Miss Marple breathed evenly and waited. The figure stepped back into shadow, unseen, unheard. Miss Marple smiled kindly, though there was steel beneath the gentleness. For someone in St Mary Mead was very eager to keep the shed closed, and Miss Marple, smiling, kindly knew that whatever lay behind that locked door was not meant to stay hidden much longer. Chapter 6. Miss Marple heard the change in Mrs. Linton's voice before she ever saw the letter. It was early afternoon, and the house held that quiet stillness which suggested waiting rather than rest. Miss Marple had been seated near the window at the vicarage, listening to the soft ticking of the clock and the distant sounds of village life, when the vicar wife mentioned quite casually that a letter had arrived from Mrs. Linton earlier and been forwarded on at once. She said it as one might mention the weather, without any expectation of consequence. Miss Marple felt it all the same. Later that day, she walked to the Linton house under the mild excuse of returning a dish. Mrs. Linton answered the door herself, and it was at once apparent that something had unsettled her. Her smile came too quickly, her eyes too brightly alert. She invited Miss Marple inside with exaggerated politeness, and closed the door a little more firmly than necessary behind them. They sat in the drawing room where the fire burned steadily, and everything lay in its proper place. The empty space on the side table where the brooch had once rested seemed more noticeable than ever, as though absence itself had weight. Miss Marple remarked on the warmth of the room, and Mrs. Linton agreed, though she stood rather than sitting, her hands clasped tightly together. Miss Marple spoke of small things first, allowing the air to settle. She mentioned the vicar wife plans for the coming week, and the difficulty of arranging schedules when everyone was busy. Mrs. Linton nodded distractedly, her attention fixed on the mantel clock. Then Miss Marple said softly that letters often carried more than words. Mrs. Linton turned sharply. She laughed at once, a light, brittle sound, and said that she supposed they did. Bills and notices and such like. Nothing of interest. Her voice rose at the end of the sentence as though asking to be believed. Miss Marple smiled kindly and said that some letters asked for patience while others asked for courage. Mrs. Linton swallowed and turned away under the pretense of adjusting the curtains. Miss Marple noticed the letter then. It lay on the small writing desk near the window, folded once and placed very precisely, as though it had been set down with care and reluctance. Miss Marple did not look at it directly. She did not need to. She saw the London postmark at once. Mrs. Linton returned to her chair and sat down heavily. She folded her hands in her lap and spoke quickly, saying that the village must think her foolish to misplace such an important thing as the brooch. She said it with an edge of defensiveness that surprised Miss Marple. Miss Marple replied gently that accidents often occurred when people were under strain. Mrs. Linton nodded too quickly. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Linton stiffened. For a moment, she did not move at all. Then she rose and went to answer it, her movements careful, as though bracing herself. Mrs. Pritchard entered with brisk energy and an expression of concern that felt very ready. She carried a small parcel and spoke at once, saying she had heard Mrs. Linton had not been sleeping and thought perhaps a little company would help. Her eyes flicked immediately to the writing desk. Miss Marple watched the moment pass. Mrs. Linton thanked her politely, but did not invite her to sit. Mrs. Pritchard sat anyway, placing the parcel on the table and smoothing her gloves with deliberate calm. She spoke of village matters, and then, quite suddenly, of arrangements. She said it might be wise to consider resolving certain matters before they became public. She spoke of discretion and understanding, and the importance of avoiding unpleasant attention. Her voice was smooth, but beneath it Miss Marple heard pressure. Mrs. Linton replied that there was nothing to resolve. Her tone was clipped. She glanced towards Miss Marple as though seeking support, and then away again. Mrs. Pritchard sighed and said that she only wished to help. She added that sometimes help required difficult decisions. Her gaze rested on the folded letter. Miss Marple interjected with a mild comment about how difficult decisions were often easier when taken slowly. Mrs. Pritchard smiled thinly and said time was not always a luxury. As the conversation continued, Miss Marple observed small changes. Mrs. Pritchard's voice grew sharper whenever the subject of London arose. Mrs. Linton's hands trembled faintly when money was mentioned. The air between them tightened with unspoken words. Then, Mrs. Pritchard stood. As she did so, a small card slipped from her coat pocket and landed face down on the carpet. Mrs. Pritchard froze. Miss Marple saw the hesitation, the calculation, before she bent to retrieve it. She was not quite quick enough. Miss Marple saw the edge of it and recognized it at once. A calling card. Cream-colored. Printed plainly. The sort used by people who asked questions quietly and were paid to do so. Mrs. Pritchard laughed lightly and said she was always so careless. She slipped the card back into her pocket and said she must be going. Mrs. Linton did not ask her to stay. After she had gone, silence settled heavily in the room. Mrs. Linton sank back into her chair and closed her eyes briefly, as though steadying herself. Miss Marple said nothing at first. Then she asked gently whether Mrs. Linton felt threatened. Mrs. Linton opened her eyes and stared at the fire. She said no. Then she said perhaps. Then she said that some people mistook concern for entitlement. Her voice was tired now, stripped of brightness. Miss Marple nodded and said that such mistakes often led to unhappiness on all sides. Mrs. Linton spoke then of the letter. She said it demanded repayment of an old matter she believed long settled. She said it was unfair and poorly timed. She said she did not know how the sender had learned certain details. Miss Marple listened carefully and said that information had a way of traveling, especially when someone paid for it to do so. Mrs. Linton flinched. As Miss Marple took her leave, she paused in the hallway. The side table was still bare. No letters, no papers, everything removed as though the space itself were dangerous. Outside, the afternoon had grown dim. Miss Marple walked slowly towards the garden path that bordered the house. As she did so, she heard voices from the far side of the hedge. Mrs. Pritchard's voice carried urgency now, stripped of polish. Mrs. Linton replied in low, strained tones. Miss Marple could not hear the words, only the rhythm. It was the rhythm of bargaining. Then came a pause. Footsteps moved away. Miss Marple stood very still. She noticed a small mark on the ground near the hedge, a scuffed patch where someone had waited, shifting their weight. She noticed how the soil had been pressed flat by careful shoes rather than work boots. The scent of lavender drifted faintly on the air. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment and smiled kindly, for the letter had changed more than Mrs. Linton's voice. It had revealed who was afraid of being answered, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that the shadow in the garden was no longer merely watching, but pressing closer, growing bolder with each quiet demand. Chapter 7. Miss Marple knew the shadow would return, because it already believed it was safe. The evening settled over St Mary Mead with that particular stillness which suggested not peace, but expectation. Lamps glowed behind curtains, and the hedges along the lanes thickened into dark shapes that seemed to lean closer as the light faded. Miss Marple sat by the vicarage window with her hands folded loosely in her lap, her posture relaxed, her attention very precise. She had positioned her chair earlier in the day, with mild consideration for comfort, but also for view. From where she sat, the line of sight carried just far enough to the Linton garden wall. The vicar wife spoke quietly nearby, reading from a parish letter and commenting on arrangements for the following week. Miss Marple responded when appropriate, but her eyes remained gently fixed on the window pane, watching the slow dimming of the garden beyond. She had learned long ago that people who believed themselves unobserved rarely behaved carefully for long. A small sound broke the stillness. Not loud. Not sudden. The faint scrape of a shoe against stone. Miss Marple did not lean forward. She did not rise. She simply watched. A figure moved along the edge of the Linton garden, close to the yew hedge where shadow clung thickest. The movement was smooth, confident, unhurried. This was not someone afraid of discovery. This was someone accustomed to this path. The figure paused near the garden wall. Miss Marple noticed the way the head turned slightly, as though listening. She noticed the stillness of the body that followed, the deliberate patience. Whoever it was knew exactly how long they could wait. A gossip remark surfaced earlier in the day and returned to her now with clarity. Mrs. Harris had said that some people always knew which gardens were empty in the evening and which were not. It was said lightly, almost jokingly. Miss Marple had smiled at the time. Now she thought of it again. From the darkness near the hedge, the figure moved closer to the wall and stopped beneath the yew branch where the narrow black scarf now hung. Miss Marple had seen it earlier that afternoon, tied neatly, not dropped or forgotten. It had not been there. The day before. A signal. Miss Marple felt no surprise, only confirmation. She rose quietly and crossed the room, telling the vicar wife she was going to step outside for air. The excuse was unnecessary, but habits were comfortable things. She wrapped her shawl about her shoulders and stepped into the cool night. The garden lay silent, the grass damp beneath her shoes. She moved slowly, never directly, keeping to the path as though merely strolling. From this angle, she could not see the figure clearly, but she did not need to. Another shape emerged from the far side of the garden. Edward. He walked with an air of impatience, thinly disguised as nonchalance, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders set. He stopped near the stone bench and glanced around, his movements sharper than those of the shadow near the wall. Miss Marple watched how he looked first towards the house, then towards the hedge. He did not look at the ground. He did not look at the shed. His attention was fixed entirely on the wall. He spoke quietly, too quietly for words to carry. But Miss Marple observed the change in his posture when the figure by the wall shifted. His shoulders tensed, his head tilted forward. A moment later, another presence entered the garden. Mr. Hale. He came not from the hedge, but from the direction of the shed. His steps measured, his hands empty. He stopped several paces away from Edward, his body angled defensively. Miss Marple noticed at once the difference in his manner compared to the others. He did not look towards the wall. He looked at Edward. Edward said something sharp. Mr. Hale replied, his hands lifting slightly, palms outward, a gesture of explanation rather than challenge. Miss Marple saw Edward step closer. The figure at the wall did not intervene. That told her more than any overheard word could have. She moved a little closer, keeping to the shadows herself now, though she made no effort to hide. If she were seen, it would change nothing. She had already been noticed by those who mattered. The argument grew more animated. Edward's gestures became broader. Mr. Hale's tone remained restrained, but Miss Marple caught the faint edge of frustration beneath it. She saw Mr. Hale glance once towards the shed, then back at Edward, as though reminding him of something agreed upon. Edward laughed suddenly. It was a harsh sound that did not match the quiet of the night. He said something that made Mr. Hale step back. And then, the figure at the wall moved. Mrs. Pritchard stepped forward into clearer light. She did not hurry. She did not raise her voice. She placed herself neatly between Edward and the wall, her posture calm, her expression composed. Miss Marple observed the way Edward stiffened at her appearance, the way his confidence faltered. Mrs. Pritchard spoke in a low, controlled tone, her head tilted slightly as though offering reason. She placed a hand briefly on Edward's arm. The gesture was gentle but firm. Edward shook it off. Mrs. Pritchard's expression hardened for just a moment, before smoothing again. She glanced towards Mr. Hale and dismissed him with a single look. He hesitated, then turned away, walking back towards the shed without protest. Miss Marple noted that too. Mrs. Pritchard turned back to Edward and spoke again. This time, Edward lowered his voice. Miss Marple could not hear the words, but she could hear the change. The sharpness had gone. What replaced it was calculation. Edward glanced towards the house, then towards the path, then towards the wall. Mrs. Pritchard nodded once. The agreement was reached. Miss Marple shifted her weight slightly and allowed a twig to snap beneath her shoe. The sound was small, but in the quiet garden it was enough. All three turned at once. Edward's face drained of color. Mrs. Pritchard stiffened. Only Miss Marple remained entirely at ease. She stepped forward into the edge of the garden light and greeted them pleasantly, as though she had encountered neighbors during an evening stroll. She commented on the chill and said how quickly the evenings had grown darker. Mrs. Pritchard recovered first. She smiled and said she had been checking on Mrs. Linton. Edward muttered something about fresh air. Miss Marple nodded and said that fresh air was often helpful when one felt restless. Her gaze rested briefly on Edward's shoes, still marked faintly with soil. She then turned to Mrs. Pritchard and remarked on the scarf tied to the yew branch. She said it was unusual to see such a thing left out overnight. Mrs. Pritchard said at once that it must have been Mr. Hale. She said it lightly, as though the explanation were obvious. Miss Marple smiled and said perhaps. She allowed her eyes to travel to the garden wall and linger there for a moment longer than politeness required. The wall stood quiet and ordinary, offering no sign of the secrets it sheltered. Mrs. Pritchard shifted slightly. Miss Marple wished them good evening and turned back towards the vicarage without another word. She did not hurry. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard footsteps retreat, not running, not arguing, simply dispersing. Back inside, Miss Marple sat once more by the window and folded her hands. She watched as the garden emptied and the shadows reclaimed their places. The scarf still hung from the yew branch, unmoved. She thought of the hymn book note, the time, the words garden wall. She thought of the shed forced shut from the inside, the lavender scent, the letter that had pressed too hard. Everything had converged tonight. The shadow had returned not to steal, but to secure its position. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Because shadows that grew confident also grew careless, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that the final truth would not wait much longer, for the garden had revealed not only who met there, but who believed themselves untouchable. Chapter 8. Miss Marple chose daylight because secrets looked very different when asked to stand in it. The garden was arranged with deliberate care that morning. Chairs were placed neatly beneath the winter roses, the iron table wiped clean, the cups set out as though nothing more serious than polite conversation were intended. Mrs. Linton moved about the space with composed efficiency, though her face carried the pale look of someone who had slept little. She greeted each guest with courtesy, her manner steady, her voice calm. It was only Miss Marple who noticed how often her eyes traveled to the garden wall and then away again. Mrs. Pritchard arrived early, dressed with particular precision, her gloves immaculate, her expression fixed into something resembling cheerful anticipation. She spoke warmly of the weather and praised Mrs. Linton for hosting despite everything that had happened. Edward followed shortly after, his manner restless, his gaze already searching the garden as though measuring distances. Mr. Hale arrived last, quiet and reserved, his cap in his hands, his eyes lowered respectfully. Miss Marple took her seat with a gentle smile and accepted her cup of tea, as though this were any other gathering. She spoke pleasantly of the roses and remarked on how well they had survived the season. Her voice carried the same warmth it always did, the same reassuring calm that invited others to relax. That was precisely her intention. Conversation flowed easily at first. Mrs. Pritchard spoke of village matters and church plans. Edward responded with polite impatience. Mr. Hale listened more than he spoke. Mrs. Linton poured tea carefully, her hands steady now, though Miss Marple noticed the effort behind it. When everyone was settled, Miss Marple set her cup down. She did not clear her throat. She did not raise her voice. She merely said that gardens were remarkable places, particularly old ones, because they remembered everything that happened within their borders. The effect was immediate. Mrs. Pritchard's smile faltered for the briefest moment. Edward shifted in his chair. Mr. Hale lifted his eyes. Mrs. Linton froze, then slowly turned towards Miss Marple. Miss Marple continued gently, speaking as though sharing an observation rather than an accusation. She said that paths worn smooth told stories of repeated use, that gates showed when they were handled too often, that soil revealed who had stood where and when. She remarked how easily people forgot that gardens watched quietly while people spoke loudly elsewhere. Mrs. Pritchard laughed and said she had always found gardens comforting. Miss Marple smiled back and agreed. She then said that she had been thinking about the brooch. Mrs. Linton drew a sharp breath, then steadied herself. Miss Marple said she believed the brooch had never truly been lost. It had been moved. Placed somewhere deliberately, not to steal it away forever, but to tempt someone into returning to the same place again. Edward stiffened. Mrs. Pritchard said at once that this was an interesting theory, though her voice had lost its lightness. Miss Marple nodded and said it had been placed in the shed. Mr. Hale looked up sharply. Miss Marple turned towards him with kind eyes and said that he had never been meant to be suspected, though someone had tried very hard to make it appear that way. The new padlock, she said, the talk of missing tools, the convenient timing of complaints, all suggested a careful effort to shift attention. Mr. Hale flushed and said nothing. Miss Marple explained how the shed door had been forced shut from the inside, how the scratches on the wood showed panic rather than theft. She spoke of the lavender water used to mask the scent of damp soil, a domestic habit borrowed to disguise an outdoor act. She spoke of the greenhouse, where lavender did not belong, and of the handkerchief hidden too carefully to be accidental. Edward opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Miss Marple turned to him next. She said that Edward had been used, though not entirely unwillingly. His impatience, his need for money, his sudden return from London had all made him a convenient distraction. The scrap of pawnbroker receipt had been planted deliberately, torn and hidden, meant to suggest greed rather than manipulation. Edward's face reddened. He said sharply that he had done nothing illegal. Miss Marple agreed. She said he had only allowed himself to be seen where someone else wished him to be noticed. Mrs. Pritchard laughed then, a short sound edged with irritation. She said this was all very dramatic, and she wondered what Miss Marple intended to suggest next. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. She said she intended to suggest nothing. She intended to explain. She spoke of the hymn book, of the pressed sprig of yew marking a page, of the pencil note that read garden wall. She spoke of the calling card dropped too carelessly, of the letter that demanded repayment of an old matter and arrived with perfect timing. She spoke of the meetings arranged quietly, always near the wall, always where shadows fell thickest. Mrs. Pritchard's face hardened. Miss Marple said that Mrs. Pritchard had believed herself indispensable. She had known Mrs. Linton's financial history, had offered help that slowly turned into pressure. She had hired someone to ask questions in London, to uncover details that could be used as leverage. When the brooch disappeared, she saw an opportunity not to steal, but to control. Mrs. Linton's hands clenched together, But she did not interrupt. Miss Marple said that Mrs. Pritchard had moved the brooch herself, placing it in the shed when panic set in, intending to retrieve it later, or use its disappearance as further pressure. When the shadow was seen, she had shifted plans quickly, locking the shed and spreading talk to redirect suspicion. Mrs. Pritchard rose to her feet. She said this was absurd. She said Miss Marple had no proof. Miss Marple smiled and said proof was a matter of perspective. She gestured gently towards the shed. Mr. Hale stood without being asked and walked to it. Mrs. Pritchard protested, but her voice lacked conviction now. Mr. Hale unlocked the door with a key he produced from his pocket, his hands steady. Inside, on a small shelf behind a stack of pots, lay the brooch. It caught the light quietly, as though relieved to be seen. Mrs. Linton covered her mouth. Edward stared. Mrs. Pritchard sank back into her chair. Miss Marple spoke softly then, almost kindly. She said that Mrs. Pritchard's greatest mistake had been believing that careful planning could outpace quiet observation. She had relied on urgency, on fear, on the assumption that no one would question her concern. But concern that pressed too hard revealed itself. Mrs. Pritchard did not speak. Mrs. Linton found her voice at last. She said quietly that the debt had been settled long ago, and that she had endured weeks of pressure out of shame rather than guilt. She said she had been afraid of scandal, afraid of the village talk. Miss Marple said gently that villages talked anyway, but they also listened. The matter was resolved without raised voices. Mrs. Pritchard left the garden pale and silent, escorted later by arrangements that did not require Miss Marple involvement. Edward stood awkwardly, then murmured an apology, and went indoors. Mr. Hale returned the shed to order with quiet dignity. Miss Marple remained seated beneath the roses. Mrs. Linton approached her slowly and thanked her, her voice unsteady but sincere. Miss Marple patted her hand and said that the garden had done most of the work. As the afternoon light softened, Miss Marple stood and prepared to leave. She paused near the garden wall one last time and looked along its length, now ordinary and harmless. She smiled kindly, for shadows only held power while they were allowed to remain unnoticed, and Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew that the garden of St Mary Mead had finally spoken the truth it had been holding all along. The garden returned to its proper silence in the days that followed, as though nothing unusual had ever disturbed its paths. The winter roses lifted their heads again. The gate latch settled into honest use, and the wall cast only the shadows it was meant to cast. St. Mary Mead resumed its familiar rhythms with remarkable speed, for villages had a great talent for absorbing disturbance and calling it normal. Mrs. Linton moved more lightly now. The strain that had once pressed upon her voice was gone, replaced by a quieter confidence. She no longer flinched at letters or lowered her tone when speaking of ordinary matters. The brooch rested once more in its place, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a reminder that fear lost its grip once named. Edward departed soon after, a little chastened, a little wiser, carrying with him the uncomfortable lesson that impatience made a person visible in all the wrong ways. Mr. Hale returned to his work with renewed ease, the garden responding gratefully to hands that belonged there. As for Miss Marple, she accepted thanks with gentle deflection and spoke instead of roses and weather and how gardens always told the truth if one listened long enough. Then she took her leave, content once more, for she knew that evil rarely arrived loudly. It preferred tea tables, careful words, and quiet pressure. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, walked on, leaving the village safer simply because someone had finally paid attention.